We turn to your years of advising government, the CIA, and of course, more broadly, the field of enterprise. How bad is this looking? How much are we returning to escalation now?
Hi, Caroline. Great to be on with you. And I agree with Michael Shepard that the honeymoon we saw coming out of Geneva a few weeks ago is now shattered. And we're back in this cycle of escalation between the U.S. and China. And I agree with you that at the center of this is technology. What's interesting about China's very strenuous reaction to the U.S. export controls on the Huawei Ascend chip is their propaganda apparatus has long been arguing that the U.S. export controls are ineffective and that China can work around them. But I think the level of emphasis they're putting on this, the volume at which they're really screaming for these things to be removed indicates just how effective and how painful they are on China. So we're going to be watch to see how the U.S. reacts going forward. China is trying to press the U.S. very hard to make more concessions. After Geneva, the tariffs came down significantly, but really at the heart of those tensions were China's export control on rare earths and then the U.S. export controls on AI chips and related tooling.
Let's go to AI chips first before we get to rare earths, because there's not only the criticism coming from China, but some U.S. companies. I just think of what Jensen Huang was telling our own Ed Ludlow last week, how much basically we're forcing China to innovate and how he longs to be able to access that market. Do you ever see that happening?
I think it's all about the scale of compute that's needed. China can always find workarounds through smuggling, through making some of their own chips, but it's really all about scaling. And as you talk about on your show a lot, really being able to make enough chips to supply the rapidly escalating demands of compute in this age of AI is at issue. And that's where the U.S. still has this very large lead, just being able to scale up. So if China is able to extract any additional concessions from the U.S. so that they can get more chips legally, that's going to help them kind of shrink the gap faster. However, if the U.S. keeps these export controls in place and enforces them strictly and gets allies and partners on board on some of the tooling, some of the aspects where countries like Japan and the Netherlands and Germany are strong, then this gap between the U.S. and China in compute stands to lengthen over the coming months and years.
But both sides have chips on the table here that they can play and play hard. I was just at the Reagan National Economic Forum on Friday, where there was a lot of anxiety just how confident Chinese leadership is at the moment, that they too can fight back. Liza, what about the rare earths signals? How much pain could that levy on U.S. industry itself as well?
We know that the auto manufacturers and the defense manufacturers they came crying to the U.S. government before the Geneva talks and said that these things are starting to impose pain and in starting to impose work stoppages. And that's something that it's a gray rhino. I mean, the U.S. national security establishment has known about this dependency on China for rare earth processing for years, but they haven't come up with a solution at scale. But I think what was interesting over the last month is that China has broken the glass on actually using this coercive instrument. It's actually now ratcheting up pressure. Xi Jinping has an appetite for leverage, and now that he knows he has this leverage over the U.S., you're going to see him pushing again and again to kind of recycle this leverage and try to extract more concessions from the U.S. But rather than bending over and giving China more concessions over the last couple of weeks, you've seen them doubling down with this empowered Commerce Department strengthening and broadening the export controls.
So you don't expect the U.S. to blink in this moment. What advice do you give to the private sector right now as to how tough this could get for access to rare earths and indeed, in the flip side, if you're a Chinese company, access to U.S. chips?
Well, I think that the private sector needs to remember that this isn't just a competition about tech and trade. I mean, tariffs and technology export controls, of course, are incredibly important to markets, but perhaps even more important is to watch the geopolitical tensions that are unfolding in the Indo-Pacific, around Taiwan, in the South China Sea. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, just on Saturday at the Shangri-La Forum, was warning that a Taiwan crisis could be imminent. And we know that China frequently has military drills, kind of these practice exercises around Taiwan and in the South China Sea. And it's had the habit lately of not announcing these in advance. So it's not giving markets a heads up that these are going to happen. Why does it do that? It wants to preserve ambiguity. If outside observers aren't sure if this is just a drill or if it's something more, an actual rehearsal for something like a blockade. That's very worrisome because it shrinks the window of warning. And that's something that we're watching very closely at Garnault Global, kind of the links between these technology export controls, tariffs, and the potential for some kind of supply chain disrupting crisis around Taiwan that could prevent the chips from getting out of Taiwan, perhaps for a couple weeks or longer.